Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Florida Sound Archive podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Kaiser. And for today's interview, I have with me Pete Gordon, who's been in a lot of bands over the years, especially in South Florida. We'll talk about a lot of those bands as we get into the interview. Pete, welcome on in. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. I've been looking forward to having you on the podcast for quite some time. And today's the day. So let's go ahead and dive right in because
All right.
you're still a very busy musician, is that right?
I try to be, yeah. I try to be active in music still, yeah.
One of the things I noticed about your music these days is you've definitely been playing a lot more guitar. And also I saw you playing drums in one of your bands.
That's correct. I always wanted to be a drummer, and over the years of being in bands, as the bass player, as soon as the drummer got up from the kit, you jump behind it and play your little do bat do bat bat do bat beats, and just always wanted to play drums. And then finally got the opportunity with some friends here in North Carolina, and we started a little band just for fun, and it's turned into something pretty good actually. So I switched to guitar around 2010 when I moved out to Oregon, and I didn't bring any of my gear with me, and started just a little punk rock band from some dudes in the kitchen where I was a bartender, and never looked back. Haven't played bass since.
Oh, wow. And you played
Yeah,
bass in all of your Florida bands.
pretty much, yeah.
Let's go back to that early period. Firstly, how did you learn how to even play music? Where'd you get those chops from?
Well, I come from a long line of drummers. My father and brother were both drummers, but they were very heavy into like salsa, merengue. Like growing up in my house, that's pretty much all I ever heard. My parents were salsa dancers, and big family occasions, Thanksgiving, Christmas. After dinner, all of the congas and timbales and cowbells and shit would come out of the garage, and they'd sit out on the patio and pretty much just jam for hours. So, I always had that rhythm instilled in me from a young age. And I, had influences in the neighborhood of other drummers, always wanted to be a drummer. And I came to the realization that there was no way I was ever getting a drum set. And my good buddy Chris Hawkins was like, man, everybody plays drums. You should play bass. Nobody plays bass. So at that time, I had been working in the old Coral Springs Mall, the one on Sample. And
Yeah, it's now the charter school.
right, yeah, it has been for a while.
I
But that used
know.
to be like, it used to be a pretty heavy like metal hangout. With the arcade there and the movie theater and the little courtyard, Sid's Records and Jack's Music. So I went into Jack's and I rented a bass for $25 a week. And the next day we started a band. I think I was 12, 11, 12, something like that. Took some lessons from at first Adam Cole, who was a legendary South Florida guitar player. I don't know what band he played in, but if you grew up in the 80s and took guitar lessons, you probably know who Adam Cole is. And then eventually Dan Fontana and Barry Alpert and Boogalard, practiced in my neighborhood. So those guys and Hawkins lived in the same neighborhood as Dan Fontana. So took lessons from them, and then just started playing in bands.
Did you ever get a chance to see M. Bouglard back in that period?
Oh yeah, for sure. With several different lineups. Before Jordy was in the band, when Craig Israel was the singer. Um, uh, George Kokoris, his house was maybe 3 blocks from mine. So we used to go over there all the time, and his brother Alex and me were good buddies. So yeah, I used to see them practice. I've seen their shows
I
all
mean,
the way back to the.
from what you can remember, were there any other bands around that area that sounded like them at that time?
Yeah, I mean, in those years from like 84, 85, 86, like metal was pretty much the dominant like scene. Punk was there. You had your skater kids and your punk kids, but metal in especially Coral Springs and Tamarack and metal was pretty popular. So I remember Joey Schnessel was the original drummer for Malevolent Creation, and they lived around the corner from a buddy. So we would go over the garage and watch Malevolent play. You had the Ethiopians, you had Panic, Demonomacy. Yeah, you had a ton of local metal bands. Um,
And Joe
and there
Schnessel
was,
wasn't he was in Hellwich.
yeah, he was in Hellwich. Yeah,
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 yeah. Yeah,
yeah. I got to see them play too.
I used to grab coffee with him and some other dudes at Starbucks for
Uh-huh.
like for many years, and he would tell stories about the early Hellwich days and all that. So
Oh man, I saw them at the Thrash Can with Cynic, Carcass, and Death. Like one of the two times that I ever got to see Death play. It was pretty awesome.
I bet. What was that like? Seeing a band like Death, who is one of the most well known death metal bands ever come out of Florida.
I was blown away by them. Again, another Joey Schnessel story. We were hanging out at the gas station, smoking cigarettes, being cool. And he pulls up and he's got a 5.0 Mustang. And the doors open up and I just hear like, "Born dead to this world." And I'm like, "What is that?" And he's like, "Oh, Death." So the next day I went to Record Bar and brought Scream, Bloody Gore, and Leprosy. And I was like, this is fucking awesome. So yeah, they were great. I think I actually saw them once where they pulled the PA because they were playing too long, and you could still hear Chuck screaming, over the amps with no microphones, with no PA. It's pretty intense.
Yes, it is. Yeah, totally. I want to go back to the first band you were in. You mentioned that you were was that in like middle school at the time or early high school?
Yeah, Zero Hour was started in middle school. It was myself and Chris Hawkins, Travis Cromwell, Andy Canner, and Paul Cordova. And we played mostly covers in those days. We did some Metallica, some Megadeth stuff, maybe some Anthrax, and we had maybe one or two originals. Real silly, kind of basic stuff. We only played one show, which was my first show, and that was at Club Soda in Coral Springs. Are you familiar with that one?
I've only heard stories about Club Soda. I was
Okay.
too young to experience it.
Yeah, it was like a teen club. I think it was something before that. I can't remember the name. I don't think it was Nepenthe. I think it was something else. Um, but yeah, they used to have shows. So we played a battle of the bands against a band called Tempest Fugit. And the rumor had it is these dudes used to spray WD-40 on their guitar necks so that they could shred faster. I hope somebody from this podcast like knows them and sees that and like, no, it's not true. Uh, Needless to say, they won. They were a little older and more established. I mean, we were like 11 and 12 years old. And maybe 3 or 4 days before the show, Andy was like, "My parents are taking me to the Keys. I can't go." So we got Josh Capular. No, not Josh Capular. I can't remember. We got somebody to fill in on drums and in like 2 days, so we weren't tight, and it was a travesty. But hey, we got to play, and I saw people moshing, and I think Robin from Demonomacy like fell and broke her ankle. So it was a good time.
What did your parents think about you being in a band like that at that time?
Um, I think that they were happy that I had an outlet and that I was playing music and doing something like that. They did not agree with the style of music. My brother and sister grew up in the '60s. My brother went to Woodstock, so they definitely know about rock and roll and shit like that. But heavy metal in those days kind of had a bad rap. You had the Satanic Panic and everybody suing Twisted Sister and Ozzy, and so there was a little bit of contention as far as what I was playing, but my parents always supported me playing music. They were definitely behind me.
Good. Well, it's good to hear. And
They
yeah, I
never
think
came out to the shows though.
so. They never saw you play in any of your bands you were in.
I don't think so. We used to practice in my garage in the Ego Trip years, and most of the people in Ego Trip were like skinheads, CSMP, Grudge. So there's always a running joke. Every time I see Tommy Sheridan, it would be my dad be like, "Peter, another one of your bald friends are here," and he said like we sounded like a bad bar mitzvah band or something. That's about all the comments I got.
The things too, because you mentioned Ego Trip, and was that the first like real serious band that you were in, where you actually were playing original songs?
Yeah, I'd like to think so. So Hawkins and I were always kind of a core, musicians playing together, and even before, like, he may have just started playing guitar, we would sit in his bedroom and like I would bang on a fan and a phone book as drums, and he would play like guitar riffs. And I'm a year older than him, so when I became a freshman, he was still in middle school. So 0 Hour kind of dissipated, and then I was going to school with like Rich Thurston, who was an Ego Trip, and that's where ninth grade is where I met like Chris Golbach, Spikey, and Brian Johnson, Scott Norman, and all those guys. They were, I don't know if Lester was still a senior maybe that year. I don't know. They were like the cool punk rock kids, and they hung out by the elevator, So
Was this Taravella?
This was Taravella, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
So being a musician and just kind of being around in whatever scene there was, the Coral Springs Mall, the Coral Square Mall. I kind of knew those guys. They were older kids, but once I went to high school, we started becoming friends. So yeah, Ego Trip, I guess, would have been the first like real band writing originals. It's when I kind of started to transition from being a metalhead, getting more into like hardcore, and different styles of music at the same time. Like ninth grade, the summer before ninth grade was the first time I really experimented with cannabis, and like would go to parties with like surfer dudes, and it was like the first time I heard Bob Marley. And like for the next few years of my life, everything I owned was red, green, and gold, and like started listening to like 24/7 Spies and more Bad Brains, and getting into even bands like Psychofunkapus, and like there was this really weird crossover like metal funk thing even before like Infectious Grooves became a thing. So yeah, my musical taste started changing a little bit in high school.
I know when I had Drew DeMaio on the podcast, he was reminiscing about his time at Taravella, and he kind of remembered you as like the cool punk rocker or metalhead who had all the cool shirts that you were wearing. You remember those some of the shirts you had back in the day?
I think anyone from that era can relate to the Black Flag song. Like I had a skateboard, I was a surfer, I had dreadlocks, I wore tie dyes, I put braids in my hair and shit, like anything to be out of the norm of like, Taravella, redneck jock, like, kind of rich kid, Z Cavaricis and shit. And I was like, I don't have anything in common with these people. So, yeah, I do remember having, crazy hair and tie-dye shirts and,
That was always a stigma. Like going, I thought like it was just me, but I felt like that was a stigma. Like if you went to school in anywhere in Coral Springs, people thought that you were like a rich kid.
Yeah.
I didn't
Yeah, it's
understand
true.
it. Yeah, I don't
Well,
know
I
if
mean,
that's
there were a lot of affluent neighborhoods in Coral Springs,
that's
for
true.
sure.
Yeah.
We we were antisocial at best. We hung out in forests. If you grew up in Coral Springs, you know where that upside down glass building is on Riverside and University. Well, there's a forest right next to it. It's still there.
It is.
And one day we found a couch, and we brought the couch back into the forest, and that became the spot. And we went from there to Don Carter's in Tamarack to the Everglades Dike, and that was pretty much where we hung out. We didn't go to cool parties. We didn't, none of us had cars really. We rode bicycles and shit, and we hung out in Tamarack a lot more, especially once I got into high school and met like Les and Chris, and they were all grew up in Tamarack. So
Was the Everglades Dike you're referring to, was that off sample?
no, End of Atlantic.
Okay.
And in those days, you could also get there from Southgate and McNabb. This was before Sawgrass Expressway, which is now what 75 Extension, was even built. Used to just kind of and those were like parties were. There were huge bonfires. The end of Wiles Road, the end of Locks Road, like it was no man's land. You could go out there and shoot guns and go off roading. When we were 14, we bought a Chevette for $100 off our buddy's brother who won it in a pool game at Don Carter's, and we just used to drive it off road and smash into stuff and like yeah,
Good
it was
times.
yeah, it was fun. And now when I go back there, you can drive all the way up to Atlantic and there's a parking lot, and for us when we were kids, you ride your bike there and you ride out a mile or two in the Everglades and there was nobody. There was no cops.
Right.
There was no people. There was no jocks. Like it was, you can do whatever you want out there.
Yeah, not anymore. All times have changed.
Yeah,
But,
sure have.
Sure have. So, what do you remember about the first Ego Trip show you played?
Wow, that's a good question. I can't remember what our first show really was. Um, it was probably a lot of fun. There was a really cool hardcore scene in Miami at that time, and even though we were Coral Springs kids, we kind of felt like Ego Trip was based out of Miami because that's where we played mostly. Washington Square, the Red Room. I think we played the Junkyard once before too. So it was a pretty heavy hardcore scene. The other three members in the band were members of Grudge, which was like a skinhead faction, if you will. Very multi-diverse, but they were also like, they were just South Beach was kind of where they were. I don't want to say headquartered or centered. It's not like they were, but that's where the shows were.
Like an organization or something.
Yeah, like the Cameo was still open. Washington Square had a ton of shows. Fifth Streets had the Red Room on certain nights, so they had punk and stuff there. I was 16 years old, so for me, I couldn't get into the kitchen. I couldn't get into half of these clubs. I would go down there with a skateboard and like hang out in the parking lot. But the shows were pretty intense. Crazy Pits, you've been in South Florida scene. It used to be kind of a violent scene at shows, so it was an intense experience playing an Ego Trip. Some of the shows you're just watching and you're like, as a kid, I was like, holy shit, this is insane. But that was also the first. What's that?
I was going to ask, what was one of the worst injuries you saw take place at one of those early Ego Trip shows?
Oh God, I don't even know. Like my brain goes to not even an Ego Trip show. It was nuclear assault at Club New, and it was like one of the most violent shows I've ever seen. Like the bands weren't even playing, and fights were just starting. Because they were playing like Anthrax on the PA, and it was just metalheads versus skinheads, and they would just beat each other. It was, and, it was okay. It just popped into my head. So being an Ego Trip was the first time I started playing out of town shows. In those days, Melbourne had a place called the Power Station. So John White, who I don't think he's still a promoter. He lives in Seattle, in Washington these days. Anyway, he would put shows on there, and we came up one day, and it was Ego Trip, Load, and there was a local band from Melbourne, and one of the opening bands came out, and dude threw a C Kyle, and that was about the end of it. I watched one of our buddies get a table broken over him, like a full on restaurant table, and he just got up and was like, "What you got?" Miami had a reputation for coming in and wrecking the house. So and then during Load's set is when all mayhem kind of broke out, and I still remember Bobby Load being like, wait, Ego Trip still has to play.
Did you guys eventually get a chance to play, or was it over?
Yeah, we played.
Okay.
Yeah, no, we played. Yeah, we still played.
Nice. Very cool. And you mentioned Melbourne was one of the places you got to play. Obviously in Miami. Did you ever get a chance in that early period to play other parts of Florida besides those locations?
In Ego Trip, I don't think so. I think it was like Melbourne. I know they were doing shows in Vero Beach at this little schoolhouse. It was like an old, turn of the century schoolhouse. Still had
Yeah.
slate chalkboards and all wood, and they would have hardcore shows in there. Um, I don't think I think we Ego Trip played out of town like two or three times, and it was mostly up in Melbourne because we had that connection with John. Um, and I don't really think we played a lot of shows in Broward at that time. Like we were all still in high school, so um,
And that's interesting because, you were from Broward, right? You lived in
right.
Broward. So why do you think you weren't playing as many shows in Broward?
Maybe availability. Um, Maybe the fact that some of the kids we knew, like Lindell and Rabbi, who were booking shows in Miami, and that's where the hardcore scene was. Like Fort Lauderdale in those days was still like rock candy cover bands and hair metal. So I think our sound really didn't fit so well in that era. Like was that somewhere around 88, 89?
I think Lindell worked at Blue Note, right, in Miami?
That is correct. Yeah.
What are your memories of some of the record stores back in that period? I know you mentioned some of the ones in Springs. What about some of the other locations?
Far Out Records by far was the one that stands out the most, because that was a Broward location, and Tim Pagonis had such an influence on the South Florida punk scene with Far Out Records as well, a label as well as a store. Yesterday and Today um, was a good one. Blue Note, of course. Um, I didn't have a car till I was 19 years old, so I didn't really get a chance to go. There was a there was a place called Record Haven in Margate on Atlantic, and it was just this little store that was dedicated to only metal stuff. Like that's where you got your Maiden T-shirts. That's where you got your patches and your records and stuff. Um, was it called Record Haven? Memories.
Yeah, I
I don't have a
know.
lot of brain cells left.
There was a place in Coral Springs, and for the life of me, it may have been more towards the later '90s, but
Mhm.
there was a place in a strip mall in Coral Springs, and it was a small little shop, and he would cater to all the death metal and heavy metal. You go in there and find, obituary T-shirts and that sort of thing, and there was no
If it
place.
was if it was off Atlantic in that shopping plaza where it's now a Walmart and stuff, I believe that's Record Haven. I
Yeah,
believe that was the name of it.
it could have been. Yeah, my memories, like I can't for the life of me, I can't remember what that place was called. But I remember the guy he was very quiet and he just got a lot of
Yeah.
great stuff. There was no other place like that around town you can find. Uncle Sam's
There-
maybe, that was about it.
yeah, I don't know what year Uncle Sam's opened. I mean, of course, in the mall you had Camelot and Record Bar, and in those days metal was popular. So, I mean, I can remember like the cardboard cutouts for Master of Puppets, before it was released, and you're like, oh, the mall's gonna open, I'm gonna go buy Master of Puppets. And then of course Sid's Records. Like once you find Sid's, that's where you went because it was always a gold mine, especially before Jimbo Smith worked there, because Sid didn't know what he had. And in those days, I mean, shit, used records were $1. But I believe the story goes is one day Jimbo went in and like found treasures and like bought it for like a very low amount of money. And he's like, you should hire me because these records are worth a lot more money. And then, you know, and then having, people, work at record stores is always a plus.
What were you doing work wise back then? What kind of job did you have? Or were you working at all?
Let's see. In the high school years, I worked, well, depending. I started working when I was about 12. My father decided to retire and then decided to invest in a deli in the Coral Springs Mall. So he used to force me on the weekends to go in and work at that place. And that's where I met all like the Coral Springs metalheads from that side of Coral Springs, because that was the wrong side of Sample. and we,
I never knew there was such
we,
a thing.
it's always a joke,
Yeah.
a running joke. So yeah, I got to know like the kids from that side of Coral, because Coral Springs is a pretty big town. I mean, it's much larger now than it was when we grew up there, but um, yeah. So I worked in the deli, and then let's see, around 16, 17, I worked in the Coral Square Mall as a short order cook at Golden Greek, uh, and then like after high school, I worked in like Jimmy's Pizza. I worked for those guys for years and years and years as like a delivery driver and prep cook. Um, and once I started going on the road, it was really easy to be like, "Hey guys, I'm going on tour for like 2 months, and I'll see you when I get back." They're like, "Cool."
What was the first band you went on tour with?
Baghdad.
Baghdad.
Yeah, Radio Baghdad.
So Radio Baghdad, we talked about some of the members already of that band. I know Les has been a guest on the podcast twice,
Mm-hmm.
and Pete Gross has been on as well. So
Nice.
what do you remember about the early beginnings of Radio Baghdad?
Um, Face value at that time. They had a warehouse off Dixie, and like I said, when I got into high school, I met like Chris and Les and Scott Norman, and I used to go on Friday nights when they would practice. And Face Value was like my favorite band. Um, they were like something I hadn't ever really heard before, and even those guys, like when I first started meeting them, um, were giving me stuff to listen to. And this is punk when it went like peace punk era, like 7 Seconds, On Ourselves, and Soul Force Revolution, and they were, giving us like early Goo Goo Dolls and Soul Asylum, Husker Du, and stuff like that, and just listening to music that was way more melodic punk than I had, I'd ever heard. When I was 10, I remember listening to Angry Samoans because I had never heard curse words in a song before. Like I had an older cousin who was a big influence in music. So I'd heard punk, but I never really got into it. And they started kind of influencing me towards that. So once Hawkins got to high school, he actually joined Face Value, and he must have been 13 or 14 years old, and Chris, is an amazing guitar player. So started going to band, to their practice every single weekend and just listening to them play. And when Ego Trip, let's see the timeline here. I'm not sure what year they changed the name to Baghdad, probably 88 or something like that. I believe if you ever talk to Chris Goldbach, it came from him, and it was about the time that the first Desert Storm was kind of happening. We were going to conflicts in the Gulf, and he said he kept hearing Baghdad radio, and he just flipped it and put it as one word. The original bass player, Chris, left the band in 92, like just after I graduated high school. And I got a phone call one day and they're like, "You want to play in a band?" And I was like, "Are you fucking kidding me?" "Yeah, of course I do. Like, you guys are my favorite band." So the rest is history from there.
Yeah. And you're good friends with these guys, right? You've been for a long time, is that right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
correct.
That's
We all
awesome.
live in different locations now, but we just did a reunion show in July. So I think that would be like the last time we had all played at that lineup was 1998.
Wow. Did you think after all these years that here you are playing with the band that you played with so long ago? Do you think you still be doing it now?
I always had a feeling that we would play a reunion show if we could pull it off and put it all together. Everybody lives in a different state now, and the only person who still lives in Florida is Les. But we had an opportunity, and we made it happen. So it was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
But Baghdad had so many lineup changes over the years. At first, it was Lester, Chris Pabone, Chris Goldbach, and Scott Norman, and then Hawkins joined the band, and then Scott left the band, and then Gary joined the band, and then Hawkins left the band, and Scott came back to the band, and then Ponch left the band, and I got into the band, and Pete Gross joined the band. Like there was a lot of different, and then Pete Gross and Spiky were both playing with Collapsing Lung, so they left the band, and John Bindle, who was a drummer for Hudson and the Shrooms, he played with us, and I think we even have like a recording that somebody posted on YouTube with him playing drums on it.
Yeah.
So it was cool to have that. I mean, once we started touring, that was the core lineup was, two Petes, two Chris's, and a Les.
That's a good mix.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Those are,
I think Baghdad, it was like the main band you were in where you put out the most output. Is that right?
that would be correct.
Yeah.
Spiky is a fanatic about recording, even when it was like a little 4-track thing and we'd do it in his parents' living room. Or we do it we were always making recordings. We were always putting out like our own tapes. And then once we kind of met Jeremy Staska from Studio 13, what the hell is the name of their band? It's on the name, tip my tongue. Is it not Sinful Lust? Was it Sinful Lust?
Sinful Lust?
I don't know. Is that it? Was that Jeremy Staska's band?
I think it was. Yeah, I think it was Sinful Lust. Yeah.
Yeah, that band Shockmaw. The world's most aggressive primate just got mad. Shockmaw. Yeah, so then we started recording it at Studio 13, and if memory serves, I believe Spiky found like an ad in the back of Maximum Rock and Roll, and it was a German label looking for bands to put out. So he sent him one of our demo tapes, and we signed Friendly Cow Records, and they put out 120 Years. And they were like, hey, look, we've never been to the United States. We don't know anything about, touring in the United States, but if you guys can get to Germany, we'll put on a tour here for you. So we definitely made that happen. And that's where we started touring. That was spring of 96, I think.
Okay. Yeah. Sounds about right.
Yeah.
What was it like recording with Jeremy?
A lot of weed.
I've heard that come up many times from a lot of guests.
Yeah, definitely. It was always a good experience. We always recorded live and went back and did vocals. So, I mean, we would practice 4 nights a week, for several hours until we were tight. And then we just go in there and bang everything out. So it was, this was before Pro Tools. This is when everything was recorded to tape. And then DATs came along, digital audio tape. And then I'm trying to recall what record it was, where things changed and got into that like DAW interface and, where it started to get really, really advanced. But it was fun. Those days were great. I personally hate recording. It's my least favorite part of being a musician, because I'm a semi-perfectionist and I'm a really sloppy musician. So when I'd have to go back and listen to my bass lines or, guitar work, I'm like, oh God, can I just do this over?
Is there a certain song in the Baghdad years that you're just really proud that you made?
My favorite album, which now has a title that's Hooked on Ebonics, is my favorite Baghdad record. It's our every time I listen to it, I'm like, is the tape speeded up? Like, or were we playing that fast? Like, it is a fast, aggressive record. Is it Behind His Back? I don't know. I had to go through all of these songs, when we were practicing for the show. I go back and I listen. I'm like, all right, I was a pretty decent bass player. I'm not going to complain on that one. But yeah, that would be my favorite record that we did. We also had a habit of like recycling certain songs. I think Chances When is on every album we ever put out. Someday, for some reason, which was a song written way back in the 80s by Face Value, and we kept putting that one on records for some reason also, and usually had the year behind it, someday 97, someday 93. But I can't think of like one song that really stood out. No Resurrection, I think, got kind of the most notoriety because it made it to the Blasting Room comp. So we recorded 665 with Bill Stevenson, Stephen Egerton, out of the Blasting Room in Fort Collins. And still to this day, like I will shamelessly admit every time I see Bill Stevenson, I'm like, oh, dude, we recorded the Blasting Room. He's like, who? And I'm like, Radiobaghdad. And he will literally start singing the lyrics to No Resurrection. It's happened 3 times now. Last time I saw the Descendants, I did it. I was standing there in the back and I waited purposely for him to walk by. I was like, hey, Bill, and it happened to Hawkins and I. We went to punk rock bowling one year and we ran into Bill in the lobby. And we're like, yeah, we're in Radiobaghdad. And he just starts fucking singing No Resurrection. It's pretty funny.
I could be wrong, but I think Baghdad may have been one of the only Florida bands that Stevenson recorded.
I don't know the facts on that, but that could be.
Somebody fact check that.
Yeah, right. Do you have a fact checker over there?
I don't. No, unfortunately not. It would have to be me. So, but yeah, so one of the things that also came up on Instagram was memories of the haunted warehouse. You know what that's all about?
So Chris's Spikey's brother-in-law, had some property along Sample Road, and for a really long time, we practiced in this. It was like an old medical facility from like the 60s, like doctors' offices, and I mean there was always like weird shit in there, and it was right next to a Crayer funeral home that had a crematorium in there. So sometimes you'd go to practice and you could smell the bodies being cremated. After we got out of there, we moved into this huge warehouse. It was like a big kind of U-shaped thing. And we knocked out a bunch of, it was like a storage unit thing, like real janky with like, plywood storage boxes. So we knocked a bunch out and cleaned it up and built a little quarter pipe in there. And his brother-in-law was like, you guys aren't skateboarding in here. And they're like, no, it's a sound barrier. We use it so it blocks the sound. And he totally bought it, which is just hysterical. But yeah, it was creepy. It was creepy and dark. And we would have shows in there sometimes. I think Good Riddance actually was in town and their show got canceled. So we hosted them and they came and played there. We always had like little parties, and it was right across the street from the Cell Block on Sample Road. The Cell Block and the Porthole Pub were right there in that vicinity. So we played there often because we could literally just wheel our amps across the street and play over there. I don't know about haunted. I personally don't know if I believe in ghosts or not, but some weird freaky shit would happen in there that you just can't explain. Doors closing, things slamming, things falling off the wall, shadows in the shadows. I don't know what I saw. I smoked a lot of pot.
You mentioned Crayer. Actually, I worked for Crayer once upon a time, and and I worked for another funeral home in Davie, and I remember hearing some things from time to time. So I don't know. Could be. So during that period though, playing at that warehouse, were there other warehouses you also would practice in and play that other bands from the area may have shared similar warehouses with Baghdad, or maybe shared warehouses along the same strip?
Yeah, Collapsing Lungs. We shared a similar space for a while. Before I was in the band, they shared a space with Marilyn Manson. And these were like all the old warehouses off of Dixie and Old McNabb, and in those areas, in those days, I don't know if it's still like that. There was not, they were industrial areas. There was train tracks, and there wasn't a whole lot of people living there. And if they did, it was very low income neighborhoods, and nobody gave a shit. So nobody ever called the cops. So you could practice, till midnight, and nobody cared. But it was always like storage facility warehouses, big bay door, sweat your ass off in the summer all the time trying to practice. We shared a warehouse with Load off of Dixie. Right, if you know where the Dixie Pig is, it was right across the street from there. And there was also Charlie's Rustic Bay Inn at the end of the warehouse bay, which is a fucking legendary bar, which I'm not sure if Bimini Bay Bar is what it evolved into, but I'll leave those stories for a different podcast.
What's one of your favorite Bobby Load stories?
Gosh, there are a lot of them. Probably banning him from my apartment in Fort Lauderdale. Let's think.
I mean, wait. You brought that one up, Pete. So what happened about?
Well, we used to have a lot of after hours parties, and I don't remember how it happened, but I remember that he got banned, and one time he came and with Pat Joyce, and there was a huge parking lot of a bank across from and he's just sitting in Pat's car. And I remember coming out there. I'm like, "What are you doing?" He's like, "Well, I'm banned from your house, so I'm just sitting out here." And I was like, "Shut the fuck up, Bobby! Like, come in here." I knew Bobby from way back. Ego Trip played with them. Like I said, I was 16 years old, 17 years old. But Load was like my favorite local band. The 2 times in my life that I've gotten a concussion were at Load shows. One was at Churchill's, and I smacked my head on that pole right in the middle of the dance floor. And Jeff and I were closer friends, and I used to jump up on stage and sing along with them because I fucking loved Load so much. And Bobby would get mad at me and he'd be like, "Oh, your band already played." And Jeff would be like, "Fuck you, he's a fan." And they would get into a fight on stage about me singing and shit like that. So our relationship wasn't contentious, but a lot of the times it was like that.
Yeah. Yeah, you mentioned Churchill's. What are your memories of seeing shows there?
My first show there, I got lost. I turned down the wrong Second Avenue, and I was driving this little tiny Subaru Justy with a 215 bass cabinet in it, and I had never driven through those parts of Miami in those days, and I was a little freaked out at Churchill's because on that corner you were totally safe, but off that corner in those days it was real. It was real. Hearing gunshots, seeing people get mugged or whatever, homeless people. But on that corner you were safe. There was a little dude, Joaquin. You gave him $2, and your car didn't get fucked with, and he would draw a little picture of you and stuff. And then you as I would go to more and more shows, you'd start to know some of the people. And then one dude used to bring me like curried goat, and you were just eating like awesome like Creole food. And back in the day, it was a fucking dump. Like if you ever took a shit at Churchill's, you should I think that was when COVID came out. They're like, if you ever took a shit at Churchill's, then you're immune to COVID or something like that. It was fucking gross, man. It smelled like piss. Usually we would just hang out in the parking lot and get lit because nobody cared. You could bring your own beer into the place at times. And I stopped going there after a while. It just started becoming a hassle. And then I was like, now I have to pay $8 for a Newcastle because your bar was in a movie or something. I was like, I started to dislike going down there after a while, but the early days were chaos. Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
Yeah. Yeah, I've heard a lot of stories, and unfortunately I missed that early period, but I did get a chance to see Baghdad at the Coral Springs Civic Center because I lived right across from Mullins Park, so it was walking distance. And Baghdad played one of the Chaos shows, and I had a chance to walk over there. And I'm so glad you sent me a picture of Baghdad playing at the Civic Center because I haven't seen many pictures from that period. So, what was it like playing in a place like that?
It was kind of cool. I'm pretty sure the first show that we did there was Hurl. So that was like after 92. It was Hurricane United Relief Live. There was a whole bunch of bands. and it was fun. Like that was the first night I met Jason Morgan, because WKPX was like a sponsor or something of the show. And I think it was like Collapsing Lungs and Radiobaghdad. And I know Les has the flyer somewhere. I don't even know if Marilyn Manson played that at that time. And I think that was the first show. And then they started doing a series of shows in, I'm assuming it was like the Gymnasium. And it was great because I was like, all right, this is like kind of hometown. And all the kids can come out because it was all ages shows. We weren't playing like Squeeze and Reunion Room and Rosebuds and, you know, where it was 21 and over for most of those venues. So like the Civic shows were all ages and all the kids can come out. And I thought that was fun just to see, like, you know, that the scene is still alive. And I think a lot of bands kind of came out of that era, you know, of Coral Springs kids going to shows there.
Yeah. Yeah, because they were all ages, and that was one of the few places you can go and see a show. So you mentioned Marilyn Manson a couple of times. Did you ever play any shows with them?
No, not that I recall. I only saw them once. They opened up for Suicidal Tendencies at it was the Button or Summers on the Beach. And they got booed off stage. I don't even think they had a drummer at that time. It might have still been a drum machine, and Brad and Scott and Brian. And, you know, I mean, they're playing to a crowd of like a bunch of dudes in suicidal hats, you know, and like standing there like this. And they were not well received.
Definitely not the crowd you would expect to be fans of that.
No, like I don't know how Marilyn Manson got to open up for Suicidal Tendencies. That was an odd booking, to say the least.
So one of the pictures you sent me is of Scott Patesky on stage with one of your bands called The Clap, which I think is that mostly a cover band?
All covers.
All cover band.
Yeah.
So did you have any kind of relationship with him prior to that?
Yeah. Scott and I were pretty close. I miss that dude a lot, actually. I didn't know him during the Manson years because I wasn't a fan of Marilyn Manson. You know, I was way more into punk rock. And the night that he and I kind of became friends, I think we had just gotten home from touring Europe or something, and we were at the Poorhouse, and I walked up, and he was very condescending and sarcastic, like, "Oh, Radiobaghdad, you guys are so cool. You just got back from Europe," and blah blah blah. And I didn't know who he was, and I walked in and I asked the bartender, I'm like, "Who's that fucking asshole in the army jacket?" You know, and they're like, "Scott." I'm like, "Scott who?" And like, "Scott Patesky, he was in Manson." And I was like, "Oh, really?" And I walked outside and I just ripped him a new one about not having eyebrows and wearing fishnets and carrying a lunchbox, and just totally ripped into him. And I'm like, so later that evening, he came over and he's like, "Hey, man, I'm having some people over at my warehouse after the bar closes. I'd like you to come by." And we kind of just hit it off. You know, we became really, really good friends. And I think one of the main reasons is because I always, you know, Scott had a huge reputation as Daisy Berkowitz, you know, and a huge following. And I always told him, I'm like, "Your music sucks." And like, I was like, "Marilyn Manson sucks," and blah, blah, blah. So like, you know, I wasn't just a fan or something trying to be his buddy or whatever. Even though I had always offered to play the bass for 3 Ton Gate and, you know, whatever other projects he was working on.
I love the 3 Ton Gate. I really love that project.
I like that way better. I mean, Scott had, like, you know, his sound was like nobody else's. You know, you knew if he was playing because of his tone and his style. But yeah, so anytime the Clap would play, like he would always get up and sing "Where's My Mind," which, by the way, every time we played that song, like, always incited violence, like, because the girls would get into the pit and somebody would get pushed and then a fist fight would break out and then the whole bar would turn into like a melee. That happened several times at the Poorhouse at a Clap show, usually on Halloween.
Did you all play a different arrangement of it? It's a pretty chill, relaxed song.
No, that's the thing. And that's the thing. And like, it was always like, no, we didn't play it any faster or heavier or anything. We kind of stuck to the original format of all the songs that we did. It just, I don't know why. I don't know why the Pixies just inspired violence in at our shows, but
I guess in South Florida it doesn't take much.
that was also the truth. But that band was a lot of fun.
Did you ever get a chance to see Scott's cover band, the Linda Blairs, play?
I don't think so. I remember that, but I don't think I ever got to see them play.
I saw them play at a place called Dastardly's off 441 in Commercial, and I saw them play at the Roxy off of Federal twice, and they were a lot of fun.
Yeah, I bet. Who else was in that band? I don't remember.
I don't know. I don't know the names. It's been too long. I still have my T-shirt though. They had a Linda Blair. They had a Linda Blair's T-shirt, and on the back of it, in blood splatter, it said "Kill Bob Saget." The irony there. So,
yeah, right.
But they dressed in drag. They dressed in drag, and they would do. I think it was mostly. Memory might be off, but I think it was mostly like 70s and 80s covers.
Nice.
Yeah. So yep. Baghdad definitely got a chance to tour overseas in Europe. What are your memories of touring with Baghdad overseas?
I mean, that was such an experience. The first year we went was 96, and getting off the plane and taking a train to, Central Station in Amsterdam was like, we were all just dumbfounded. We had never seen architecture like that. We had never seen, a city that old, and felt like we were at like a set at Universal Studios. And then it was like, oh wait, we can walk into this cafe and get beers and hash. And like, we were blown away. And then the shows and the exposure to like the European punk scene, which was pretty different from what we were used to. A lot of our shows were at youth centers and like anarchist squat houses, and the reception was so much different. Like people there really love to hear you play and really want you to keep playing. In fact, they wouldn't let you stop playing. There were a couple of tours that we did that our sets were like 3 hours long. We would play literally every song that we had. Then we had a list of cover songs that we would do. And there were even nights that like we would just make shit up just to keep playing. They don't ever want the party to stop, especially in Germany.
3 hours is a long time for a punk rock band to play.
Dude, tell me about it. And then they want you to party. Yeah, we make party, like afterwards. They want you to keep going. I'm like, bro, I've been making party for like a month. Like, I just want to sleep, man. I'm sick and I'm tired. But I'll never forget those experiences ever. Just the energy from some of those places, and you have your good shows and you have your bad shows, and then you had to deal with also like the people who thought it was cool to have anti-American sentiment and start fights, and we were in Brno in the Czech Republic, and some like agitators came in and Lester actually got punched, and then it was like somebody's got a gun, and there were some crazy times. A lot of the times some people were great, you could have awesome conversations. Some people really did not like the fact that we were from the States, and they're like, you are a capitalist enemy, and I'm like, bro, I live in a van with like 5 people. I haven't taken a shower in a fucking week, and I'm playing in your fucking squat house. Like I'm not the enemy, bro. Like, you might need to find somebody else to blame that on, I guess.
That makes sense.
I mean, these are very, very small instances. I mean, most of it was a lot of fun, a lot of partying, great people. I mean, I still have friends in Europe from those days. And like 1997, Hawkins, after the tour, stayed for 2 months, 3 months, got a job at Trashmark, which was like a merch company. They pressed T-shirts and stuff like that. And he lived in Germany for a couple of months after the tour. And once Car Bomb started going, and I had friends over there, I would do the same thing. I was like, okay, tour's over, I'm going to hang out. And I had a partner for a minute that lived in Germany, so I would stay there for a few months and just kind of live and float around. It was great experiences. And like I said, we still have friends till this day, that we met in 96. So we're going on almost 30 years. you
Yeah.
know.
Was that the last time that you had a chance to play music overseas like that?
No, Car Bomb went quite a few times. See, Car Bomb started in about 2000. We went once on our own for a tour, and then we did a really large tour with No Use for a Name, Useless ID from Israel, and Bigwig from New Jersey. And that was like, it started in California, went all the way up across Canada and down to Boston. And then we flew to Europe for a whole month and, toured all across Europe with Car Bomb for that. And that was an insane tour. I mean, it was crazy. It was like 15 countries or something like that.
Wow.
Yeah. And then once Car Bomb ended, a few years later, we decided to do a little tour, and we got Joe Jitt from the Shakers to play drums. And it was me, him, and Spiky. And I think this was 2006 or 7. And we just went for like 14 days, 10 shows, and had a blast and was super well received. And then the following year, we took the Shakers and Radiobaghdad did a tour. With Spiky playing guitar, me on bass. Lester couldn't make it, so last moment we got John Owens to fill in. He's been in, Seville, Anchorman, Bacon Andes. So he filled in on vocals, and that was a really, really fun tour. I think Adam Konstrucka came along with us, and Malt Liquor Riot played a few times. So then the next year, I thought we were going to go again, and they just did Malt Liquor Riot and the Shakers, and Baghdad didn't go. And I moved the following year out of Florida. So yeah, I think 2008 was the last time that I got to play overseas.
What for you was the biggest difference playing in Baghdad and playing in Irish Car Bomb?
Having to be a singer and a frontman. The last tour, 1998, that Baghdad did, we did a U.S. tour with Digger and from PA, and Lester didn't come to Europe with us, so we were kind of forced to sing. We all took turns, like me, Hawk, and Spiky, and Pete singing different songs. And then when Car Bomb formed, we kind of had the same feel. We would write songs and we would all sing. Originally, when Car Bomb first started, Hawkins and Spiky would switch back and forth between drums and guitar on certain songs. And then it just, as we started getting a little bit more serious and going on the road, that kind of ended, to be more solidified, I guess.
Was singing out of more of necessity, or did you really like just enjoy doing it once you finally had the chance to do more vocals?
I don't mind singing. I like it. I hate my voice. When I listen to recordings, I feel like I sound like an angry Muppet, because my lyrics are extremely juvenile and I just yell like a hardcore guy, What I didn't like was being a front man. I did not like having to crowd banter. I'm a fucking idiot and stupid shit comes out of my mouth all of the time. So having to, forcefully make up something to say to the crowd was terrible. I hated it.
Well,
I hated being
what
up.
was one of the most awkward moments you had doing that?
Uh, gosh. I mean, I had some fun doing it. We played Jacksonville. We were on tour with Lagwagon, Rufio, and Yellow Card. And we opened up the show, and I was like, "Hey, what's up, we're Irish Car Bomb. We're from Fort Lauderdale." And the guy in the front row was like, "You fucking suck," And so I'm like, "Oh, we suck." I'm like, "You probably never heard us before." I was like, "Hey, let me ask you a question." I'm like, "Do I come to your day job and slap the dick out of your mouth?" And the whole crowd, like 2,000 people, was like, "Ooh!" We just busted into a song, and I was like, "All right, that was kind of awesome."
Good one.
Yeah, that was pretty fun. I'd have to say it was like in a write up that we got. We played somewhere in Canada, and it was an all ages show. And this was the Frostbite tour, and that was the Mad Caddies were the headliners, and it was like Choke and Pulley, Closet Monster, and us, and we had partied pretty hard in Toronto or something like that, and I was talking about it, and the guy who wrote the article found it pretty inappropriate for what I was talking about at an all ages show, and like gratuitous drug use or partying or whatever, and at that time, once I read that, I was like, I'm a fucking idiot. But like I was forced. They're like, you got to talk to the mic, you got to talk to the crowd, you got to like say stuff, and I'm like, I don't want to. And then sometimes I guess we were on tour with No Use, and we would do a cover, and Matt Riddle, I would always like, you guys into old school hardcore punk songs or something like that. And I think I regurgitated it one night because I didn't know what to say. And he called me out at the show, and he's like, yeah, I would have said, are you guys into, old school hardcore punk, but the asshole in the first band already said that or something like that. And that's like, so yeah, I'm glad I don't have to be a front man anymore.
Yeah, those sound like they were pretty fun times, looking back.
Of course. Yeah, of course.
So Irish Car Bomb played with a lot of bands that you mentioned, No Use for Name, Lagwagon, Pulley, and there were several that you called out. So during that period, was there ever any talk with any of the labels that were around back then to perhaps put out a record from you guys?
Yeah, we were on Purple Skunk Records, Tommy Berman out of South Florida. And after our first record, our guitar player Shannon was from the West Coast, and he had worked for bands as a tech and a driver for a very long time. So we got to talking with Fat Mike when we were playing some Warped Tour shows, and he was pretty interested in us, and he really, really liked our first record. So there was talk of putting out our next record on Fat. And he had a showcase one morning at Warped Tour at like way too early in the morning on the main stage, way too hungover, and like 90 degrees at 10 o'clock in the morning, but that's where the talk was. And it kind of fell through the cracks, and I saw him a few years later, and I happened to actually was driving No Effects around like Fort Lauderdale after a show they played at Revolution, and I straight up asked him, whatever happened with signing the Fat, and he said, honestly, man, like I really didn't dig your second album, and it's really hard to sell records. And I thought that was like one of the most genuine answers I could have heard, and that was kind of that. It would have been awesome if we signed to Fat Records, but Radiobaghdad was on some small labels. We had Friendly Cow in Germany and One Foot Records, which I don't know if they even still exist. I want to say that he was out of Texas, but I'm not really sure.
Yeah, I think it was out of Texas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was about the closest that we came to signing with, I guess they're still an independent label, but a larger independent label.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's an interesting story. And the fact that, it seemed like it came pretty close, but at least, he was upfront with you,
Yeah. I like I said, that couldn't have been more of a genuine answer. He didn't give me any bullshit. He straight up told me I didn't like your second record. And I'm like,
yeah,
cool. Very cool.
At what point did you guys call it quits?
I want to say around 2004 or 5. I think Hawkins had moved out of town. Yeah, I don't remember actually the actual year that we decided to stop playing. We only put out those 2 records. We self-released our second one, I think, also on Purple Skunk. Ain't Quite Right. And then I don't think we had anything after that. Yeah.
You regret not doing like a 7-inch or anything like that?
No, not really. I think Car Bomb was what it was. It was a fun band. It was a great project. We had some fun songs. We did some really fun tours. Met a lot of great people. Like I said, we did it again in 2007 with just the 3 of us. And then people kept asking us about Radiobaghdad while we were over in Europe. So next year we did Baghdad. I'd love to do a Car Bomb reunion show as well. That would be fun.
Yeah.
I
How's
don't
that
think it. Go ahead.
how's that make you feel, hearing people still bring up, bands like Radio Baghdad and Irish Car Bomb after all these years?
I mean, it's great. I'm glad that people still listen to it. At the Baghdad show, there was some tall dude with dreads, and he was singing like every single word. I'm like, I don't know who this person was. I'd never seen them. He was much younger than us, but he knew like every word to our to every song. I was like, this is great. I like to think that we had, maybe some influence on the South Florida music scene, and I like the fact that people still, recognize us for being in those bands. I think, Baghdad had a much more longevity than Car Bomb did. They had been around for a really long time, and when that scene was just kind of like, exploding in the 90s in South Florida, I look back at that whole time, and it's very nostalgic because it was unlike anything today. I talk about it with I'm in a band now with somebody who had never played in a band before until we started this, and we're on Instagram, we got to make posts and we got to do this and stuff like that. I'm like, flyers used to be you cut out a bunch of shit, pasted it to one page, Xerox that, and then ran off a bunch of flyers, super DIY, really punk rock. No graphic designers were making punk rock flyers for local bands in those days. And then you'd go out on Thursday night and you would flyer Squeeze in the reunion room and Rosebuds or whatever. And you'd be in the parking lot, and you'd be seeing people from other bands, and you'd hang out and you'd talk, oh, and your show and this and that. And you'd get back to your car and there'd be like 5 flyers on your windshield, for all the shows that were happening. And the scene in the 90s was just so, I guess, eclectic, like you would have shows with 10 bands and none of them sounded the same. You'd have a metal band, you'd have a funk band, you'd have a Jane's Addiction sounding band. I mean, there was like Bologna Sandwich and The Itch and I can't even remember half the bands from that era. And you had WKPX, which was like a huge promoter for local bands. A certain percentage of what they played like was supposed to be local, and you could totally like selflessly, shamelessly self-promote and be like, hey, can you play that Radio Baghdad song? And they would play Stanley Bing, and I thought that they were like a really integral part of the South Florida music scene. You had Jason Morgan, who was Hudson and the Shrooms. He had 2 hours of rubbish on Fridays and would just play all, punk from that era, a lot of Fat Epitaph kind of stuff. You had Ellen Goldberg, who had a show on like Mondays or Tuesdays, and she would play more of like the kind of indie punk and like pop stuff, like Superchunk and Jawbox and, that side of punk. And I thought I just, that was, to me, it's really, really nostalgic, being able to turn on the radio and like hear so many like cool local bands and cool punk bands and not have to listen to like Zeta or WSHE or whatever the fuck those crappy classic rock songs. Like if I heard Hotel California one more time, I was going to fucking blow up a radio station,
I remember late at night though, it may come a little later, but Zeta had its own Zeta Goes Local where they'd play, they play like bands like The Goods. I remember, and other bands from that period. Yeah. So, yeah. But yeah, KPX. I still have some tapes, not a lot. I probably have 2 or 3. I used to dub whatever I could off KPX. So like stuff. I'm sure I still have some stuff. Probably Baghdad's on there. Maybe Quit. Against All Authority. Nice. Yeah.
I still have so in high school, the janitor in my high school was this punk rock lady who had gone to Taravella, and she knew my cousin, and we started talking. So she started giving me all of her cassettes from Bob Slade's show, WRLN, Off the Beaten Path. Right. And I had never really listened to it before. I mean, I think Chris Golbach won tickets to every fucking show at the Cameo off that show. But yeah, I mean, there was that radio show as well. Not something that I unfortunately tuned into enough, but Bob Slade managed Load for a while, and he was also an integral part of the punk rock scene down there. I don't know what he's up to these days. I think he was in the Load documentary. I'm not sure. I've only seen it once or twice. But yeah, I think having that, really, really helped. And like I said, like the nostalgia of looking back on that scene and City Link Music Fest or XS Music Fest, and like shutting down downtown Fort Lauderdale and Radiobaghdad getting shut down by the cops at Tavern 213 because there were too many people, and the owner got like moshed to the ground or something and grabbed the cops, and the cops came in and shut us down. And my dumb ass was like, "Fuck the pig, start a riot," and they're like, "You're going to jail. You need to shut up right fucking now, or you're going to jail." He said, like, one beer bottle breaks, I'm taking you to jail for inciting a riot. And I was
Wow.
like, okay.
Was that the closest that you ever got to getting arrested at a show like that?
Yeah, probably. But the positive side is I created a relationship with the local beat cop down there. Later that night, he saw me. I'm like, "I'm sorry, man. I'm not causing any trouble." And after that, those days in downtown Fort Lauderdale, there was nothing. You had the tavern, you had the poorhouse, and a couple other spots. And he would see me, and if somebody was smoking pot, he'd be like, "Hey, man, can you go tell your buddies to stop smoking pot so I don't have to arrest anybody?" So I kind of, as a positive that came out of that, I ended up being friends with Mike. So let's see. There was an incident at Mullins Park before I was in the band where I was technically emceeing the show, and I was being quite inappropriate and a lot of profanity at a family event at Mullins Park, and the cops pretty much took me off the stage. And there was also at the Civic Center where I was wearing a Hollandale police chief shirt, and I kept introducing myself as Officer Richard Head in the microphone, and Coral Springs cops didn't like it.
That's the worst place to do that because the police station's right around the corner.
I was such a fucking idiot. I was way too fucking punk for my own good in those days, and like I said, alcohol and a microphone in front of me, a lot of stupid shit came out of my mouth. It was a different time, that is for sure.
Yes.
In those days, punk rock to me just meant fuck you. That's kind of where it was.
What does punk rock mean for you today?
It is a very different scene. It is definitely more inclusive. It's definitely less violent. It's more, it was always accepting. You could always be like kind of a freak, but people still got shit, I think the youth today is definitely more inclusive. They're more accepting of everybody. Not to say that we weren't. It was just a different scene. And from what I hear, it's much less violent than it was, back in those days.
I could see that for sure. And
I
just
haven't heard. What's that?
No, go ahead.
I haven't really heard a lot of new punk rock that does it for me anymore. My musical likings through my life has always changed. I listen to a lot heavier stuff these days. I need tuned down guitars and fucking blast beats and like real hardcore shit.
Yeah. Yeah, there's some good stuff still coming out of that genre for sure. And of course,
but at the same time,
you got the classics
if you look at
to fall back on.
Yeah, totally. I Asheville here has a lot of cool little punk dive bars, and there's a great DJ that like every third Sunday will do like afternoon set for like 2 hours, and he's from Gainesville, and he'll play some killer stuff. And that's when they're like, "Oh, dude, you got Radon, you got Asshole Parade, you got Them Builder Ass, Panther UK, United 13." Like the Gainesville scene, man, had so many killer bands that came out of it. So that's always fun, and of course, hearing any kind of old school punk stuff when you're out at a club is always nostalgic, and you're like, yeah. But in my personal, if you went to my Spotify playlist, there's Black Breath, and then there's Thievery Corporation. So my musical likings are all over the place.
Nothing wrong with that. You're in different moods, and it's,
of course,
you got to have a nice mix of stuff to play. So you called out several Gainesville bands back then. Being so far south, it was always tough. I felt like in some cases to get all the way up north to go to like Gainesville and stuff like that. Did you ever get a chance to make it up there to see some of those bands play?
Yeah, Baghdad played in Gainesville a lot. We would play Gainesville, Tampa, Orlando, not Jacksonville in those days. That was car bomb that would go up that far. But yeah, especially in the mid 90s, we were playing Gainesville quite a bit. That's when the hardback was like kind of the focus, and there was also house parties all over the place. I mean, Gainesville had the student ghetto there was like the coolest neighborhood ever. The first time I saw that, like standing at a 7-Eleven, like dude with like green dreads and a mohawk and blah 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 blah, and I'm like, fuck, this town's cool. Like, we don't have that down south. It's not as common to see. Maybe at a show, but not like at the grocery store. But there was such a cool music scene in Gainesville through the 90s. I don't know if it still exists. I haven't been back there in a long time, but
Yeah.
yeah, we used to go up there and play all the time because a lot of our friends moved up there and went to school, or some of them just went up there to live because it was different than South Florida. But yeah, I've seen Van Builder Ass, I've seen Radon, and I think we played with Pantro UK. We played with Hot Water Music back in the day. The best show that I can remember was a house party at a friend of mine's house, and it was Radiobaghdad and Load, and we fucking destroyed that dude's house. Like, I mean, it was insane. Chuck from Hot Water Music's head went through the speaker in my bass cabinet, and like the most rock and roll thing I ever saw was Jeff Tucci smash a beer bottle on the cymbal and slide the neck of the beer bottle and use it as a slide on his guitar. I was like, oh, yeah, it was such a fun show.
Those are the moments that are just lost to the ether because they never
Yeah.
were recorded, and you just have them in the
Yeah.
memory.
It's true. Like, you don't have, it's a blessing and a curse. I'm extremely happy that people didn't have handheld, video recorders in those days. But like you said, a lot of those things were lost. It wasn't captured. Gladly, we definitely captured a lot of our European stuff. Lester always brought a camera with him, a video camera to record. And one of our buddies, Mike, would always just randomly show up while we were on tour, and he would have one, or he would take Les's camera. So there's a ton of video footage from our tours in Europe through the 90s.
Where can people find you these days?
Well, I'm in Asheville, North Carolina. I'm playing drums in a band called the Tiny TVs. It's kind of rock and roll. You can find us on YouTube, some old videos that we had from some live shows. We're looking at getting into the studio and recording a record. This band definitely needs to be documented. It's been fun. We started it as just a couple of friends I had mentioned before. One of the guys had never, ever been in a band before, barely played the guitar. And we're like, you're going to play bass? He's like, I don't know how to play bass. I'm like, either did Sid Vicious. Look how cool he is.
Quite the comparison there.
Yeah, right. So, it was like, well, what do we need to be a band? I'm like, we can get a drum set. And I was like, I guarantee you tomorrow we'll buy a drum set for $100. And everyone's like, no way. Woke up the next morning, went on Craigslist, found a drum set for $100, and just kind of started jamming. And after a few months, we had like 5 or 6 songs. I'm like, these are pretty fun. And we ended up booking a show. And after that, it just kind of snowballed. Somebody recommended us to play another show. And then it just, Asheville has a pretty small local scene here. So it's just been a lot of fun. We've played most of the venues here, and it just keeps on rolling.
Now, you mentioned to me off mic that you were going to be considering moving back to South Florida. Is that?
Yeah. Situation has occurred that I have to relocate back to Florida for a while. So if anybody listening or watching this wants to play some really heavy music, I would definitely be interested in, something tuned down, really heavy, possibly instrumental.
Nice.
I'd love to get back to playing guitar. Drums have been fun, but I don't like being a drummer. It's hard work. I fucking sweat a lot, and I have to carry a ton of gear. And and this is the first time I've gotten like the drummer syndrome. Like I was at a party and somebody was talking to me and somebody else, and they're like, "Oh yeah, that band with that guy," and he's like, "Oh yeah, that's Pete. He's in Tiny TVs." You're like, "No, not him. The other guy with the blonde mullet." And they're like, "Yeah, Tiny TVs. Pete's in that band." And the guy looks me dead in the eyes, and goes, "I'm sorry, I don't recognize you from being in that band." And I'm like, "Fuck, I'm the drummer." Like so.
That's funny.
So yeah. I'd like to get back to playing some
Yeah.
guitar and hopefully can, find some people to play some music in Florida.
Well, hopefully so. And it's been great having you on the podcast, Pete.
Yeah, it's been fun going down memory lane. I mean, I had a list of things and I touched on, I'd say about 70% of them. There's so many things that you can talk about, we didn't touch on the clap all that much. That was a really fun project for a long time. Probably the most money I've ever been paid playing in a cover band. So
wow.
Also South Florida, if you need a bass player or a guitar player for some shitty 90s cover band, like I'm totally down. I'll quit my job.
Wasn't Rob Elbow was in the clap, right?
Yeah. So the clap came about in just about 98. Baghdad broke up and the Holy Terrors broke up. So Mike Boxusis, who was the drummer at that time, was a good friend of ours. And we're like, hey, let's get together and, just jam, play some cover songs or something. So we came to the table and it was mostly like 70s, 80s punk and new wave stuff, a lot of Devo, some Cheap Trick in there. And like, hey, we're not too bad at doing this. Let's book a show. And then it exploded. It was definitely a trip. We would play the Poorhouse and play 3 sets, like a cover band, and it was a lot of fun. The clap was awesome. I never thought that as a cover band we'd be as popular as we were.
Did you have a favorite cover to play?
Yeah, probably Alvita Sane from Cheap Trick. I've Got a Gun from Channel 3. Like we at one time, man, the list was so long. We had over 100 songs that we would play. Devo, of course. Like I'm a huge Devo fan. So Uncontrollable Urge is one of my favorite songs, and I would get to sing that one and play that. We actually dressed up as Devo once for Halloween and played the Poorhouse. Those plastic suits are very hot, so I don't suggest playing shows in them.
I can imagine.
But yeah, we would cover Elvis. We would cover, a song that I've been looking for on the internet by a band called the Go to Hells from St. Petersburg.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure the song was on like a No Idea comp, and it's called Back in Florida. And it's such a good tune, and I cannot find it anywhere. There's no record of it on the interwebs anywhere. That was always a fun song to cover.
Was there any song that sounded good in theory, but when you went to play it, it just, no, that didn't come off the way we hoped it would?
Probably. I can't think of songs that we dropped because of that reason. I mean, I always messed up the Elvis song, and probably So Lonely by the Police. One, I couldn't sing So Lonely, so I'd have to sing Salami, in the backup parts, it'd be Salami, Salami. But like the reggae breakdown, it was terrible.
That is great.
And the Dead Kennedys, man, the Dead Kennedys are hard. Their song structures are different, and their timing is really weird. So playing some of those songs were a challenge to learn for sure.
Yeah, I can imagine. It sounded like it was a pretty good eclectic mix of songs.
Crazy, because Rob would bring stuff, like the Gun Club and like Jet Boy Jet Girl, and I was always bringing more of the punk stuff to the table, plus Devo, and Hawkins, was a huge Cheap Trick fan, and he brought Elvis to the table, and it was a really weird mix for a cover band. The Clash, the Ramones, the Pixies, the Dead Kennedys, and then we would try to throw like obscure ones in there. I think one of the shows we played where Hawkins wasn't there, and Spikey actually played guitar. We did Joan Jett, we did Elvis Costello, and those bass lines are really hard for Elvis Costello and the Trash. Like, I mean, I faked it, but I remember playing it. I'm like, this is really, really difficult to play. What else do we do?
When you fake it, what is it? It's just like the look on your face is really intense, but you're not really like.
No, when I say I'm faking it, like I don't know that I'm playing all of the right notes, but I'm making it look like I do.
Okay.
Peace, Love, and Understanding, the bass line in that song is absolutely amazing. And it doesn't stop the whole time. And it's like these scales and it runs, so like even just trying to figure it out and not having any tablature or anything, just playing along to it. I'm like, I think I'm playing it right. It sounds right. And if I look like I'm doing it right and I, fucking get some rock moves in there, people have no idea.
With all the other sounds happening, I'm sure it kind of just blends in at some point. So did you ever get a chance to do Rob's podcast? That Record Got Me High before?
No, I never have. I would have loved to, because there's some cool records I don't think that had ever been done. I think I wanted to do On the Mouth by Superchunk, which is probably still like in my #1 slot for a favorite album of all time.
Okay. Well, Rob, if you're watching or listening,
Rob,
you gotta have Pete Gordon on your podcast, because he's got a record that got him high.
It's very true.
Well, it's been great having you on. Hopefully we had a chance. We talked about the clap, and then thanks for bringing that back around. And it's just been great having you on to tell your story, because there's a lot of things that may not have been known to people who have been around that period, who followed a lot of the bands you were in or played some of the bands you played in. So it's great getting a chance to chat with you.
Yeah, it was fun. It was fun to share my view of what the South Florida music scene was like to me, and coming into it. It was a very, like I said, I'll keep bringing up nostalgia, when I go back to thinking of how awesome it was, like, just the different genres of bands and the scene, and how it went from metal to alternative to punk, and it was good times. It was good times in those days.
Totally. As we close out, I'm gonna kind of give you the last word. Any closing thoughts you want to share, Pete, before we wrap up the interview?
Well, you asked me to think about it prior, and I really didn't, because I just kept talking. But I don't know. I hope there is a part of the youth that listens to your podcast, and that kids are out there still playing music, and I think it's a really, really important part of society for people to play music, and for bands to still keep coming out. And I love seeing the younger kids getting more and more into music at earlier ages and having bands out there, and I hope that people just keep that dream going alive, man. Like rock and roll will never die. And again, if I'm coming back to Florida and anyone wants to play some music, let me know.